Hi there. So you enjoy sitting and listening to podcasts or stories in the tranquility. You should turn on a candle. It is insanic. Some of the events they deal with are shocking, even horrific, and come to a person. So the world is today. But others are courageous. What kind of stories do you like? I hope you enjoy listening to this one. It is very interesting. Actually, like everything Bonnie and Clyde sends out. Yes, our investigative journalists call themselves Bonnie and Clyde, a name you hardly forget. So, time to listen and enjoy. See you later.
Welcome to our deep dive. Uh, we're tackling a tough topic today. It's a war that's been overshadowed by so much else going on in the world.
You're absolutely right. It's easy for conflicts to fade from our
But
attention,
the people caught in the middle,
but suffering continue.
yeah, they can't afford for us to forget them.
Exactly.
Today we're focusing on Myanmar, a Southeast Asian nation that's been in the grip of a brutal civil war since a military coup back in 2021.
Right.
Our main source is a YouTube video from ABC News In Depth titled Myanmar's Forgotten War Explained.
Okay.
Just a heads up, the accusations of genocide, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, now seemingly on the military side, a whole resistance movement fighting for democracy.
Wow.
This is heavy stuff, but understanding what's happening and why it matters is crucial.
Absolutely. And what's particularly striking is how this current conflict is rooted in Myanmar's history,
Right.
a history of military dominance and brutal crackdowns on dissent.
So let's go back in time, before the 2021 coup. What was the situation like in Myanmar? I know they have a long history with the military calling the shots,
Right.
but give us some context.
Well, the military has been a dominant force in Myanmar for decades. They've repeatedly seized power
Yeah.
and have a long track record of human rights abuses against their own people.
The ABC News report mentions a chilling example from the past, the four cuts policy. What was that all about?
Imagine a strategy designed to crush any form of opposition to the military,
Okay.
not just by targeting armed rebels, but by terrorizing entire civilian populations. That's the four cuts policy in a nutshell. It was implemented in the 1970s and 80s, aimed at cutting off support for ethnic rebel groups. They did this by destroying villages, forcing people from their homes, and committing widespread human rights abuses.
So essentially, they were trying to make life so unbearable for anyone who might even remotely support rebel groups
Right.
that they'd be too afraid to do so.
Precisely. And the truly disturbing part is that we're seeing echoes of this brutal strategy in the military's actions today. The targeting of civilians, the indiscriminate violence, the
Wow.
blocking of humanitarian aid, it's all too familiar. It shows how deeply ingrained these tactics are within the military's approach to maintaining control.
It's a horrifying cycle of violence, and it's hard to reconcile this with the fact that during some of this time, Aung San Suu Kyi was leading the country.
Right.
She's a global icon of democracy,
Yeah.
a Nobel Peace Prize winner.
A Nobel Peace Prize winner.
But her approach towards ethnic minorities, particularly the Rohingya, has been deeply controversial.
It's a complicated situation for sure. Aung San Suu Kyi spent years under house arrest for her pro-democracy activism, became a symbol of hope, and eventually led the country. But her actions during the Rohingya crisis and her seeming defense of the military during that time really tarnished her image in the eyes of many.
It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers. But let's move on to the 2021 coup. You walk us through what happened and what triggered the military to take control again.
In early 2021, the military staged a coup claiming widespread election fraud in the recent elections, where Aung San Suu Kyi's party had won a landslide victory.
Hang on a second. They just decided to take over because they didn't like the election results.
Pretty much.
Were these claims of fraud actually valid?
Independent observers largely dismissed the military's claims of widespread fraud, but regardless, they declared a state of emergency,
Right.
detained Aung San Suu Kyi and other political leaders, and unleashed a brutal crackdown on anyone who dared to protest.
Okay, so a blatant power grab. What was the immediate reaction from the people of Myanmar?
People were outraged. Massive protests erupted across the country demanding a return to democracy. But the military met these protests with incredible violence, using live ammunition against unarmed civilians.
I understand this is when we see the rise of armed resistance groups.
Yes, exactly. Faced with the military's brutality, many people felt they had no choice but to take up arms. This led to the formation of the National Unity Government, or NEG for short.
Could you explain what the NUG is and why it's important in this conflict?
The NUG is essentially a shadow government formed by elected officials who evaded capture during the coup. They're coordinating the resistance movement and advocating for democracy on the international stage. They're a key player in this conflict.
So you've got this incredibly brave resistance movement emerging, but they're up against the might of the Myanmar military.
Right.
What has the situation been like since the coup? Paint a picture for us of the human cost of this conflict.
The situation is truly dire. We're talking about widespread human rights abuses.
Oh, wow.
Villages being razed to the ground, children being targeted, and a humanitarian crisis spiraling out of control. Millions of people are in desperate need of aid.
It's awful.
But the military is actively blocking access to those who need it most.
It's heartbreaking, and it's not the first time Myanmar's military has been accused of such atrocities. We have to talk about the Rohingya crisis.
Right.
This unfolded just a few years before the coup, and it's a chilling precursor to the current conflict.
You're right. The Rohingya crisis is a horrifying chapter in Myanmar's recent history, and it's critical to understand this event to see the patterns of violence repeating themselves today.
For those who might not be familiar with the Rohingya crisis,
Yeah.
can you give us a brief explanation?
The Rohingya are a Muslim minority group who have faced persecution in Myanmar for decades. But in 2017, the military launched a brutal crackdown, driving over 1 million Rohingya people into exile in neighboring Bangladesh.
And what's striking is that the tactics used against the Rohingya, the mass killings,
Right.
the rapes,
Yeah.
the burning of villages, bear a disturbing resemblance to what we're seeing happening now in the wider conflict.
It's the same playbook of violence and terror, and the lack of accountability for the crimes committed against the Rohingya may have emboldened the military to continue these tactics in the current conflict.
Which brings us back to Aung San Suu Kyi. She defended the military's actions against the Rohingya on the world stage despite her pro-democracy image. It's baffling.
Her stance on the Rohingya crisis was a turning point for many. Some argue she was trying to maintain a delicate balance of power with the military, while others believe she genuinely shared their discriminatory views.
Wow.
Whatever the reasons, her actions during that time deeply damaged her international reputation and raised serious questions about her commitment to human rights.
It's a tragic situation all around.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got this brutal conflict unfolding in Myanmar, but what has the international community's response been?
Right.
Has there been any meaningful action taken to address this crisis?
Sadly, the international response has been largely inadequate. There have been condemnations and some sanctions, but they haven't been enough to deter the junta or to provide meaningful assistance to those suffering.
Why is that? What's preventing a more robust and effective response? This all feels so frustratingly familiar.
To understand the lack of action, we need to look at the junta's sources of power. They rely on 3 main pillars: money, weapons, and legitimacy.
Okay, so let's break those down. What's keeping the junta's coffers full and their weapons flowing?
While some countries have imposed sanctions,
Right.
the junta is adept at finding ways to bypass them. They have support from certain neighboring countries, and they profit from illicit trade, keeping the money flowing. And then there's the issue of weapons. Countries like Russia and China continue to supply arms to the junta,
Right.
directly undermining international efforts to impose an arms embargo.
It's almost like a replay of what we're seeing in Ukraine, with certain powerful countries propping up a regime that's committing atrocities.
It's a similar dynamic.
But the global response to the war in Ukraine has been swift and unified. Why haven't we seen the same level of attention and support for Myanmar?
That's a question many people are asking. The discrepancy is glaring. Some argue that geopolitical and economic interests are at play, while others point to a lack of awareness and understanding of the complexities of the conflict in Myanmar.
It's just heartbreaking to think that the people of Myanmar are being abandoned by the world while they endure unimaginable suffering.
It's a tragedy.
But what can be done? Are there any realistic solutions on the horizon? What can the international community actually do to make a difference?
It's a complex situation, but there are things that can be done. It requires a multi-pronged approach, targeting the junta's power sources, supporting the resistance, and isolating them on the world stage.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's break that down, starting with those power sources: money, weapons, legitimacy. How do we actually cut those lifelines and make the junta feel some real pressure?
Well, regarding weapons, a comprehensive international arms embargo would be a significant step. Right now, they're getting a steady supply from countries like Russia and China. Cutting that off would severely limit their ability to wage war.
That seems pretty straightforward. Why hasn't that happened yet?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But it comes down to international politics and those economic interests we talked about.
Right.
Some countries are reluctant to take a hard line against the junta for various reasons.
All right, so an arms embargo is ideal, but probably a tough sell right now. What about the financial side? We talked about sanctions. Are those doing anything?
Some countries have imposed sanctions, and those are having some impact.
Okay.
But the junta is finding ways around them. They're experts at exploiting loopholes, and they still have access to funds through illicit trade and support from certain neighboring countries.
So it's like a game of whack-a-mole. You try to block one financial avenue and they just pop up somewhere else. What can be done about that?
The key is coordinated and comprehensive action. Right now, the sanctions regime is fragmented. Some countries are taking a tougher stance than others. If the international community really wants to pressure the junta, they need to present a united front, close those loopholes, and target the businesses that are propping them up.
What kind of businesses are we talking about?
One major source of revenue for the junta is the jade and gemstone trade. Sanctions specifically targeting this industry could hit them where it hurts. But again, it requires international cooperation and a willingness to put principles above profits.
Okay, so cutting off their money and weapons makes sense. But what about that third pillar you mentioned, legitimacy? How do you strip a regime of its legitimacy when they're clearly in control on the ground?
That's where recognizing the national unity government comes in.
Right, the NUG. They're the shadow government formed by elected officials after the coup.
Exactly. Giving them formal diplomatic recognition would send a powerful signal that the world stands with the pro-democracy movement and rejects the junta's claim to power.
Isn't that risky? Wouldn't that just anger the junta and potentially escalate the conflict?
There's always a risk of escalation, but remember, the junta has already escalated this conflict to a horrific level. Appeasing them hasn't worked. A firm, principled stance is needed.
So a combination of hitting their wallets, their weapon supply, and their credibility. That makes sense, but it also sounds like a long shot. What are the chances of this actually working? It seems like the junta is determined to hold on to power no matter what, and the international community hasn't exactly been decisive in similar situations.
You're right, there are no guarantees. But history has shown us that even the most entrenched regimes can be forced to change course when faced with enough pressure and the loss of those key pillars of support.
Okay, so never say never. But it's not just about pressure from the outside, right? The resistance movement inside Myanmar plays a crucial role too.
Absolutely. They're the ones putting their lives on the line every day, fighting for democracy and human rights.
But they're clearly outmatched in terms of firepower. How can they possibly succeed against a military with so much more weaponry and resources?
That's why external support is so crucial. If the international community can provide the resistance with the resources they need and simultaneously weaken the junta through those measures we've discussed, it can level the playing field and give them a fighting chance.
What kind of support are we talking about? Weapons? Funding?
It's a complex issue, and there are ethical considerations involved in providing direct military support to any group, but there are other ways to help. Providing humanitarian aid, training, logistical support, and amplifying their voices on the international stage can make a real difference.
So it's about empowering the resistance in a way that avoids fueling the violence, but still gives them the tools they need to fight for their future.
Exactly, and it's not just about governments taking action. Individuals can play a role too.
I was going to ask about that. This all feels so overwhelming and far away. What can ordinary people actually do to help?
Staying informed is a good place to start. The more people who understand what's happening in Myanmar, the more pressure there will be for action. Share information with others. Donate to reputable organizations working on the ground. Write to your elected officials. Urge them to take a stronger stance. Even small actions can make a difference.
Don't underestimate the power of a collective voice. It's like those boycotts you see. If enough people refuse to support a company or a product, it can force them to change their practices.
Exactly. The same principle applies to political pressure. If enough people make it clear that they care about what's happening in Myanmar, it can have a real impact on policy decisions.
So it's not just about donating money or attending protests, although those are important too. It's about using our voices, our platforms, and our choices to make a difference.
Exactly. And remember, the people of Myanmar are not just passive victims. They're incredibly resilient and determined to fight for their future. Supporting them means supporting their right to self-determination and helping them create the kind of future they want for themselves and their children.
It's inspiring to hear about their resilience and courage in the face of such unimaginable hardship.
They deserve our admiration and our support. And while the situation may seem bleak, there's always hope. History is full of examples where seemingly impossible odds were overcome by the collective will of people who refused to give up.
So what's the takeaway here? What's the one thing you want our listeners to remember about this conflict and the potential for change?
The situation in Myanmar is incredibly complex, but it's not hopeless. There are things that can be done both on an individual and global level to support the people of Myanmar and help them achieve their aspirations for peace and democracy.
This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
Mhm.
I feel like I have a much better understanding of the complexities of this conflict and what's at stake, but we've talked a lot about the present and the past. What about the future? What are some of the potential scenarios that could play out in Myanmar?
It feels like we're standing at a crossroads, with so many different paths Myanmar could go down.
Yeah.
What are some of the most likely scenarios we could see play out?
Well, one possibility, and it's a grim one, is that the junta manages to solidify its grip on power. They could double down on repression, crush the resistance,
Right.
and essentially turn Myanmar into a full-blown military dictatorship.
That's a chilling thought.
What would that kind of future look like for the people of Myanmar? I imagine it wouldn't be pretty.
It would be a nightmare scenario. Imagine a continuation and likely an escalation of the human rights, abuses, the economic hardship,
Right.
the silencing of any opposition.
Right.
It would mean a generation growing up under a repressive regime with their dreams and potential stifled.
It's hard to fathom that level of despair.
Yeah.
But look, that's one potential path. What's another possibility? Is there any hope for a more positive outcome?
There's always hope. Another scenario, and this is what those who support democracy are striving for, is that the resistance movement gains momentum
Okay.
and ultimately forces the junta to the negotiating table.
So a situation where the pressure from inside and outside Myanmar becomes too much for the junta to ignore.
Exactly. A combination of military pressure from the resistance economic sanctions that cripple their finances and diplomatic isolation that leaves them with no allies could create the conditions for a negotiated transition to democracy.
That sounds promising, but isn't it a bit optimistic to think the junta would willingly give up power?
Yeah.
They seem pretty entrenched.
It wouldn't be easy, and they certainly wouldn't go down without a fight. But history has shown us that even the most stubborn regimes can be forced to compromise when the costs of holding on to power become too high. Look at South Africa, the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
These were once considered impossible transitions, but they happened.
So there's precedent for change even in seemingly hopeless situations. But let's talk about negotiations for a second. Could we realistically see a scenario where the junta and the pro-democracy forces share power in some way?
It's possible, but it would be incredibly complex. It would require both sides to make significant compromises.
Right.
And crucially, it would depend on the military being willing to relinquish some of its control over the country's political and economic life.
Given their history and their actions over the past few years, that seems like a big ask.
It's a long shot, for sure. Trust is incredibly fragile in this situation, but there are examples in other conflicts where former enemies have found a way to share power and rebuild their countries. It requires a willingness to put the needs of the nation above personal ambitions and a commitment to addressing the root causes of the conflict.
So a fragile peace,
A fragile peace.
but at least a step towards a less violent future. Are there any other potential scenarios we haven't touched on?
One more possibility, and it's one that keeps a lot of people in the region up at night, is that the conflict spills over Myanmar's borders,
Okay.
creating a wider regional crisis.
We haven't really talked about the regional implications of this conflict. What would that look like?
Myanmar is a strategically important country in Southeast Asia. A prolonged conflict could destabilize the entire region. We're already seeing an increase in refugee flows into neighboring countries, which puts a strain on their resources and could lead to social unrest.
Right. It's not just about what happens inside Myanmar.
Yeah.
It's about the ripple effects across the region.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the risk of the conflict drawing in regional powers with their own agendas, potentially leading to a proxy war. It's a scenario that no one wants to see, but it's a real possibility if the conflict continues to escalate.
It's a stark reminder that what's happening in Myanmar isn't just a local problem.
Right.
It's a global issue with the potential to destabilize an entire region. And as we've discussed, the international community hasn't exactly been forceful in its response so far.
There's a lot at stake here. The future of democracy in Southeast Asia, the lives of millions of people, the stability of the region. It's a test of our collective conscience. Will we stand by and watch as a nation descends into tyranny, or will we take action to support those fighting for their freedom and a better future?
Powerful words. This deep dive has been a roller coaster of emotions, anger, sadness, but also a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, things can change.
There's always hope, and the people of Myanmar deserve our support, our attention, and our action.
This conversation has definitely left me with a lot to think about. We've explored the complexities of this forgotten war, delved into the history that led us here, and looked ahead at the uncertain future that lies ahead for Myanmar.
It's a complex issue, but one that demands our attention. We cannot afford to turn away from the suffering of the people of Myanmar or from the implications this conflict has for the wider world.
So what's the takeaway here? What's the one message you want our listeners to leave with?
The situation in Myanmar is dire, but it's not hopeless. The people of Myanmar are incredibly resilient and courageous, and they need our support. There are things we can all do, even from afar, to make a difference. Stay informed, share what you've learned with others, and support organizations working on the ground. Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to a better future for Myanmar.
Thank you for guiding us through this complex issue, and for reminding us that even amidst the darkness, there's always hope and a reason to act.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the fight for freedom and justice in Myanmar continues. Let's do what we can to support those on the front lines and to amplify their voices until their dream of a peaceful and democratic future becomes a reality.
Dear listener, thank you for being with us all the way. Hopefully you found the discussion interesting. Bonnie and Clyde, that's what they call themselves, our research journalists, continue to dive equally into the story and in modern times according to interesting material and make it to marrow. You can know that your opinion is of great importance to us and also tips on issues that you want us to do. It weighs each of you to write a tip in the comment below or even send us an email. Until then, take a good care of yourself and your loved ones.
Beneath the shadow of a broken sky, where freedom's wings are too weak to fly, the people march with hearts of steel, dreaming of a world they'll one day feel. Chains may bind, but spirits soar. Through the pain they long for more. A brighter dawn, a peaceful shore, a life of love worth fighting for. Hear the voices of my Myanmar, rising in the night, a song of hope that burns so bright. Through the silence of the world, their cries remain, for brotherhood, for peace, for an end to pain. The streets are stained with tears and fight, yet courage blooms in the darkest night. The echoes of their shattered past are whispers saying this won't last. But where are the hands to lift them high? Why does the world just stand and sigh? The silent gaze of nations near turns hope to rage, loving to fear. Hear the voices of my Myanmar, rising in the night, a song of hope that burns so bright. Through the silence of the world, their cries remain, for brotherhood, for peace, for an end to pain. But in the hearts of the broken a fire remains, a dream of a land where no one's in chains, where children laugh and rivers run clear, where humanity conquers despair and fear. The brotherhood of all mankind, together we stand, no one left behind. Hear the voices of my Myanmar, rising in the night, a song of hope that burns so bright. Through the silence of the world, their cries remain, for brotherhood, for peace, for an end to pain. So let the world awake, let hearts be stirred, let actions follow the cries we've heard. For the people of Myanmar, we'll raise our voice, in their freedom we'll all rejoice. The struggle is long, but the dream is near, a future of love without hate or fear.